Yes, good. Okay.
Wow. You made it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
How are you doing?
I'm not on fire, so that's good.
That's wonderful. So we're so excited to have you here. We know that you've ventured into Bitcoin fairly recently, and we want to ask you all about that. I'm really eager to do that. But I thought before we do that, I thought of asking you a few questions about some things that I think a lot of people here can relate to about your background. And the first thing I thought of was to ask you about entrepreneurship, because this place is brimming with it. 10 years ago, almost none of the companies that you can see here at the conference existed. And so entrepreneurship really runs deep in the Bitcoin space. And for a person who's generally introduced to audiences around the world as a clinical psychologist, as a best-selling author, as a professor emeritus, it seems to me that you have an unusual fondness for entrepreneurship and unusual appreciation for it. And so I was curious to ask if you have any thoughts about how that might have started for you. Like, I know you grew up in a small town in Alberta. I believe the town didn't even exist until the year 1928. So I was curious, maybe that has something to do with it, but just curious about your thoughts.
Well, I think I got interested in entrepreneurship fundamentally because I'm curious, and the most appropriate way to understand something is to try it. And so when I was a junior professor, I needed some money, so that was part of it, and I tried to figure out if there was anything I knew that might have any commercial value. So there was just a practical driver, but at the same time, there was a lot of noise in the academic community, a lot of it coming from business people, that the university should do more to transfer their knowledge into the domain of practical economic utility. And one of the things I learned is that most of the people who make those sorts of noises are people who never discovered anything scientifically and never started a business. And so because they know nothing about either, they think that doing both will be easy. And it's not. And so part of the reason that so little knowledge generated in the research community transforms itself into entrepreneurial activity is because it's actually really hard to start a business. And the idea, and this is one of the things I learned very painfully over a long period of time, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, is that, you hear this idea, cliche, this is not an idea. If you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door, which it won't, because first of all, we don't need a better mousetrap, really, so it's foolish just on the face of it, but more deeply, if you have a good idea, even if it in principle is a saleable idea, and you produce a product that's in keeping with that idea, you've probably solved 5% of your problems. And my colleagues and I produced a series of tests that were aimed at helping business people hire better employees, and we had very good scientific data indicating that these tests produced a tremendously positive return on investment. So by investing a little bit of money in the screening process and thereby improving the quality of your employees, you would gain substantively on the economic front I think our calculated return on investment was something like 500 to 1, right? A no-brainer, you'd think. And so armed with that, I went out into the business world trying to sell these tests, and that's when I learned, at least in part, what it meant to be an entrepreneur. The first thing I realized was, product, that's, 5 to 15% of the problem at best. A huge part of the problem is communication, and so that would be marketing, advertising, all of that's communication fundamentally. What good is a product if no one knows it exists? And then of course sales, that's unbelievably difficult problem. And business people and academics tend to be contemptuous of salespeople, which is a huge mistake because it's very difficult to be a good salesman. And if you're a really good salesman, you're very good at fostering long-term relationships. And that generally means that you're an ethical player. And so, in any case, I was driven by two factors, by two motivations. One was, could I take what I knew and make it into something that was profitable for practical reasons? And the second was, could I learn how to run a business? And I did. I run the businesses I started. I have a lot of them now, but that business I started 20 years ago, and it's quite successful for a variety of reasons. And so what did I learn about it? Well, as I said, one of the things I learned was that communication and relationship building is an immense part of the problem of producing a product that's potentially profitable.
Right.
On the ethical front, I just did a interview with some business professors at MIT, and I think the topic was the ethics of capitalism. And I believe, and I think this is a reasonable takeaway perhaps for those of you who might want to consider what you would take away from this discussion. Starting a successful business enterprise is a profoundly ethical endeavor in the deepest sense, as far as I'm concerned. This is part of what makes me interested in Bitcoin too, because the cynical view, and many academics share this because they're jealous and they tend to sit on the left, both of those, they like to think of the capitalist enterprise as something that's fundamentally predicated on exploitation. And I think that's wrong on so many levels of analysis simultaneously that it's only possible that someone intelligent and resentful could possibly believe it, because that isn't what you do when you run a business, unless you're a parasite. And if you are, you're not going to last very long. If you're running a valid business in a free market system, you have to offer people who could choose otherwise freely something they value freely. Then you have to deliver it. Then it has to work reliably. And all of that's ethical. You promise to pay me, I promise to deliver, I do deliver, the thing I deliver works. If it doesn't work, I solve the problem. And if I don't do that, I'll develop a very bad reputation very, very rapidly, because there's nothing that destroys you quicker than unhappy customers, because word of mouth spreads exponentially. And the whole bloody thing shudders to a halt. And so one of the things I would suggest to all of you burgeoning entrepreneurs is that you don't be defensive about the ethics of your capitalistic enterprise. Quite the contrary, you should be on the offensive, claiming, like forthrightly, that what you're doing is profoundly ethical, and that you're providing free people, free customers, the option to make free choices about what they value. It's like, what's wrong with that? People are easily set back on their heels ethically when confronted by those kinds of accusations. This capitalist system is nothing but a system of exploitation. What's the proof? Well, look at your profit, and all that profit is the exploitation of others. It's like, no, that's not true. First of all, you can't run your enterprise profitably unless you run it efficiently and intelligently, because there's nothing that slips through the hands of a fool faster than money. And so if you manage to run it profitably, then that's actually an indication of your care and conscientiousness and dutifulness and ethical orientation. And then if you have even 1/10 of a clue, you take that profit and you don't do something narrowly, selfishly, and pointlessly hedonistic with it. You invest it in your enterprise, or in in a parallel enterprise, and you try to make more goods and services available to more people. And if people accuse you of nothing but greed in your attempts to do that, then I would say that says a hell of a lot more about the accusers and their worldview than it does about you. Because all of that turns out
So I wanted to ask you about your Bitcoin journey. I think about a year ago, I think is when the first time you started talking about it publicly. You mentioned you had read the article by Alan Farrington, Bitcoin is Venice, and then you followed up with in-depth conversations with several prominent Bitcoiners, Robert Breedlove, Seyfedin Amis, and then you ventured deeper even into Austrian economics. And so I was curious to ask you, I assume that before that, at some point, Bitcoin came on your radar somehow, and I'm curious, what was that initial impression like for you, and when was that?
Well, I think the same thing applies to my desire to understand Bitcoin as applied to my desire to understand the business world, which is the best way to understand something is to jump into it in some sense feet first, because there's no substitute for the real thing, or there's no valid substitute for the real thing. And, I try to stay on the technological edge insofar as at my advanced age I'm capable of that, which is, decreasingly the case. And the Bitcoin phenomena attracted my attention for a couple of reasons. One was partly because the story of its development is so unbelievable that it sounds like a fairy tale, right? It's so strange, you can't believe it's true, but it seems to be true insofar as anybody can tell, and so that attracted my attention right away. But then the idea of a decentralized monetary system, well, that is a revolutionary idea, and the more I thought about it, and it actually it makes me wary, which is something we could talk about. I mean, one of the lovely things about cash is that it is a decentralized monetary system in large part. It's not that easy to track cash, thank God, because you can be bloody certain that if it was possible to track cash, then every agency with some ethical notion, of any ethical notion whatsoever, would be tracking absolutely everything you ever purchase, trying to nudge and tap and compel you into making the decisions they regarded as ethical. And that would be fine if they were right, but they won't be. And so that's a big problem. I mean that too, because the reason they won't be right is because you actually can't make those presumptions a priori. One of the fundamental axioms in some sense of a free market system is that the only way to properly compute the value of the emerging horizon of the future is by sampling and perhaps summing the free choice of a multitude of free agents. That's actually the only way you can do it. There is no central planning way, even in principle, that can substitute for that. And I believe that that's true for a whole variety of reasons, some of which are psychological. We can't compute the future algorithmically from the past, and so we have to use mechanisms other than deterministic algorithm to plot our way forward, and part of the way we do that is by using the entire economic system as a massive computation device that uses the array of choices that everyone makes as the mechanism that values new things as they emerge. Now, central planning types, they think they can just jump over that and say, well, no, we need to save the planet, let's say. That's the ESG monsters are on beating that drum at the moment. And so they think they can subordinate that computational mechanism to some sort of ethical or procedural algorithm. And I think that's complete bloody nonsense. And worse than that, I think it's extremely dangerous because I think all the evidence, especially from the 20th century, suggests very strongly that as soon as you subordinate free market mechanisms to central planning ethical dogmas, you catastrophically affect the economic system in a detrimental manner, but you destabilize the entire society and tilt it towards totalitarianism. And we haven't learned that yet because, there's always a new generation of people that think they're smart enough to plan the world. And Bitcoin, in principle, stops that from happening. Right? By
of stepping down from the hubris of central planning towards something more humble in terms of and entrepreneurial, like building something that is, like the cypherpunks say, like you just write code and you test it and you suggest it as a white paper and allow for discussion. Is that what attracted you? The humility in it?
Well, curiosity, first of all. I thought I would be motivated to try to understand Bitcoin if I actually invested some money in it, because I do believe the proposition that you don't really make genuine decisions if you're sampling a domain unless you have skin in the game, to use another cliche. And so I was curious on that front. I was curious about the idea of a decentralized ledger of accounts, and then curious also about the notion of competitive currencies, because as someone who regards the free market as an existential necessity, the idea that alternative currencies might be produced that could give the fiat currencies a run for their money, so to speak, that seemed to me to be attractive. And then I was also attracted by the revolutionary element of the idea, which makes it not humble in some sense, which is one of the things that worries me, because it looks to me like if the Bitcoin theorists are correct, and Bitcoin does take priority over the other cryptocurrencies, which we don't know if that's the case, but it could be, that could take the monetary system permanently out of the hands of the political establishment, the political system. That's not perfect, but it's also, as a social scientist, that also worries me, because, when you do something complex, you think this is the problem with the central planning mentality. You have this notion about how the world might be a better place, and so you do something complex, like change the basis of the currency, and you think, well, here's a whole bunch of good things that will happen because of that, and you might be right about that, but there's going to be an immense number of things that happen as well that you didn't predict at all, and you have zero idea and zero evidence about whether those things will be positive or negative. And so this experiment that you're all running, I'm running, all the people who are involved in the cryptocurrency world are running, it's like, well, okay, we're going to take money out of the hands of politicians, but that also means out of our hands as voting agents, right? Because it's not just politicians, that's you guys too. We have no idea what would happen if money per se was actually decentralized. And we also don't know, like, if we manage that, let's say Bitcoin obtains primacy, is it irreversible? Like, is that permanent? And then you think, well, what if it's a bad idea and it's irreversible? I'm not saying it is, I'm not even saying I'm necessarily pessimistic about it, but the probability that you invent something extremely powerful and it only does the things you think it will do and all those things are good, it's like, no, that never happens.
Sometimes in our enthusiasm, it can be easy to lose track of that we do need to heed caution for what might happen, if not in the long run, then at least in the short run. Like, we are rattling some cages, and who knows what that's going to bring about.
That's for sure.
So I was curious to dig a little deeper into like how you look at this phenomenon of Bitcoin from your unique worldview perspective. And I wanted to read you a quote from that Bitcoin is Venice article, because I think it might link to something else you've said about Bitcoin. So the quote goes, quote, "Bitcoin may be magic internet money, but more importantly, it is money for the internet. Prior to 2009, you could send any information you wanted to anybody, anywhere in the world, instantly, except the most important information of all, value. Now we're all caught up." And then later, I heard you comment that maybe Bitcoin could be defined as an incorruptible language of value. So I'm curious, like, could you share a bit more, like, from your point of view, what does that mean?
Well, I don't think that's a particularly revolutionary observation on my part. That's the sort of thing that, especially the real Bitcoin enthusiasts, the ones who are delving into the phenomenon from a philosophical or even a theological perspective, weirdly enough, are insisting, well, it's incorruptible because there is no central agent of control. I mean, I'm just bringing polls to Newcastle here. I mean, one of the things that all of you object to is the ability of central bankers to inflate the currency. And I do think you would make a pretty credible argument that you can interpret that as a form of theft. And I'm not saying it is, because that's complicated, right? I mean, in a free society like your society, and until recently mine, yeah, I wish that was fun. You know, the people who are managing the monetary supply are elected, and that means that we do have control over the process, or at least as much control as any of us have over any political processes, and we're gonna take that away. Now, the argument is that, well, we should take that away because money's a ledger. You know, it's an exchange of labor, it's an exchange of productivity, it's an exchange of value. That's a better way of thinking about it. It's a way of tracking the exchange of value between individuals, and it isn't obvious that once you and I enter into a contract of value, that a third party should be able to alter the means by which we track that exchange for their purposes, whatever those purposes are. And again, I think that's a rational argument, but that doesn't mean it's right. These are very, very complicated issues. I mean, most of us assume that taxation is acceptable, or at least we don't, strike up the revolution because it occurs. We seem to think that there is a role for government and for the determinations that government make outside the free market per se. Obviously, the government has to exercise some control over currency, over money, in order to make its functions possible. If we take the control of currency away from the government, we don't know what that will do, for example, to taxation. If we could all of a sudden do all of our transactions in secrecy, like in real secrecy.
Well, you could argue the world was on a gold standard, and that limited the control of governments over money, and still taxation existed for many hundreds of years.
Fair enough. I guess what I would point to from the devil's advocate perspective is that, well, we shifted away from the gold standard in the 70s, and all hell hasn't broken loose. Now, I do accept the proposition that currencies have inflated, and perhaps in a counterproductive manner, but the last 60 years have been pretty damn productive economically, and so that system did work. Now, you can say, well, it could have worked better. It's like, yeah, maybe, but it certainly could have worked a hell of a lot worse. And so, well, this isn't a criticism of Bitcoin, it's just, I've watched over the years as social scientists have tried to mount large-scale social experiments with the best of intentions, and generally, almost invariably, that doesn't work.
So are you cautioning to maybe not throw the baby away with the bathwater, like how, I guess with the Reformation, the revolt against Catholicism, that huge changes happened, or the Napoleonic era, huge changes happened, and people seem to blanketly wanting to delete entire institutions. Is that what you caution?
Well, maybe things are unfolding. I'm not really suggesting that you do anything as a consequence of this caution. I'm just saying that unbridled enthusiasm predicated on the assumption that your new system will only do the good things you think it will do, that's not wise. That isn't what will happen. Now, this currency revolution might be proceeding in as positive a manner as we can expect, because at the moment what we have is, in some sense, unbridled competition between a variety of currencies. But we had that before, because you could hold currency from different countries. That was analogous in some sense. So that possibility existed before. But You have the cryptocurrencies now, and they're competing with fiat currencies, and maybe that's the right way to settle which one is more valid, is to let the competition proceed apace and let a multitude of people make their free choice and, accept the emergent winner as the valid winner.
Right.
And since I believe the market is the only way of making those sorts of calculations, then that seems like a fair approach. I suspect. Yeah, well, I suspect that there'll be a lot of obstacles along the way because I think Bitcoin is now worth more than silver. I believe that's the case.
I believe that's true, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. So that, it's silver has been a standard of value, not as reliably as gold, but maybe second or third place. And so the fact that Bitcoin has knocked it out of that position is really something. My suspicions are that there's going to be a lot of kickback at the governmental and bureaucratic level over the next 10 years. It's certainly possible for government agencies to put stick in the spokes of a very well-functioning bicycle. And because Bitcoin does present a real threat to the centralizer types, they're not going to take that line down. Now, whether they can do anything about it or not, that's a different question. But, recently in Canada, some of the trucker protest activity was financed through Bitcoin donations, and the government went after the Bitcoin purveyors, and they capitulated. And so, that didn't mean the government had direct access to the keys, but they did manage to get access to the records of the what do you call them? The intermediary.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and from I guess my turn for devil's advocacy in the Bitcoin world, the view on those kind of things tends to be, over the long run, these kind of things are beneficial because they help improve the immune system of the ecosystem of this worldwide phenomenon. It makes it more robust.
Yeah.
But I appreciate the caution, the words of caution. I wanted to ask a bit more about some of the other things you've encountered during this Bitcoin rabbit hole, because people tend to call it that way. Once you kind of go down it, there's, sometimes you don't know how deep it can go. And you had and I don't know if you'll agree if this relates to your Bitcoin journey, but you had a long conversation with Dr. Bob Murphy, who's an expert in Austrian economics. In that respect, I thought it was fascinating when you both were talking about the Austrian business cycle, which is their theory of the boom and the bust in the economy and their explanation of why it happens. And you brought up that it reminded you of the theory of your theory of the biblical flood myths and the Tower of Babel. And so I was curious if you could share some of your thoughts about that, because in the video, and I recommend everyone to watch it, it's fantastic. To me, it's like a masterclass of how to be a student, because you're so methodical and exploring this new school of thought. But so I wanted to ask you specifically that analogy between the boom and the bust in the economy and the flood myth and the Tower of Babel. How do you see that?
That's a very, very hard question, that one. So I have to wrap my head around that conversation again.
I remember the Tower of Babel, you mentioned that the superficial cause, the flood, superficial cause seems to be some kind of storm, like of course, the dikes gave in, but the more profound cause is the corruption and the hubris that preceded it, that then eventually became inevitable, that the flood became inevitable, which
Yeah, well there's two, okay, so let's see if I can make that intelligible in a relatively short period of time. At the end of the biblical narrative in Genesis, you have two types of catastrophe. One is a flood and the other is a Tower of Babel. We can start with the Tower of Babel because I think that's in some sense what the Austrian economists criticize, and also perhaps why the Brits voted to leave the EU. And so the idea would be, and this is kind of a conservative idea, that the best level of governance is the most local level possible, right? And so
I think the Swiss will like to hear that.
What's that?
The Swiss will like to hear that.
Yes. And the reason for that is that as your system develops layers, this certainly happens in business. Imagine that one of the problems you have as as a business person is that you have to be aware of your customers and what they want. Obviously, you have to be more aware of that than anything else because you're trying to deliver what they want to them. And so if you're well informed about what they want, then hypothetically you can deliver what they want and you succeed. Your sales people are the ones who are in the most direct contact with your customers. And then you can imagine building an enterprise that has so many levels of intermediary processing that by the time you get to the decision makers, none of the signal from the salespeople is left. Well, that's the Tower of Babel, is that the system doesn't even know what problems it should be solving anymore because it's got too internally complex. And, you know, you heard that mantra back in 2008 over and over, too big to fail. And when I heard that, I thought, no, you got it exactly backwards. It's so big, it will inevitably fail. And that's the Tower of Babel problem. And I think part of the reason the Brits objected to the EU was because they intuited, because in no small part it was a working class phenomenon, not necessarily complex philosophical realization, but a sense that those bureaucrats in Brussels are just too far away from us. And I think that's exactly right. I think part of the problem that the Austrian economists pinpoint is that there's going to be corrections in any complex process. As any complex process unfolds, it's aiming at a target. There's going to be corrections on both sides, and the non-Austrian economists think that they can smooth out those corrections, and the Austrians think that you should just let the corrections happen as locally as they possibly can and leave them the hell alone, because your attempts to smooth out the corrections are actually going to amplify them and make them worse. You know, I mean, one of the things that happened, for example, when we started to prevent forest fires was that, well, we had fewer forest fires, but when we did have them, they were way worse. And forest fires got so hot because so much undergrowth had built up that instead of just burning down to the soil and stopping, they would burn all the way down to the bedrock because they got so hot, and then the forests couldn't even regenerate themselves. And so it turned out that, you know, you needed some small forest fires so that you didn't have really, really big forest fires. And that's another problem with central planning. It's like, you think you can get rid of the forest fires. It's like, well, no, you can't. You should let controlled burns occur. One of the things I really admire about.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's something I think we're familiar with in the Bitcoin space, where, you know, there is no central fire suppression mechanism. There are no bailouts for exchanges. They just go bust. If they get hacked, either it's over or they figure out a way around it. And so we've had our mini crises over the years. And I think the good thing is that it doesn't build up in the way that it does in the traditional system, because there's no last resort lender. There's no sugar uncle.
Yeah, well, so Well, so in principle, you know, you guys are addressing the problem of what do they call that? Privatizing the profits and socializing the risk, which we've certainly had no shortage of, especially since 2008. And maybe that's a good thing. It could well be. I tend to suspect that it is. One of the things I think that's made America so robust, say compared to Japan, even, you know, back in the 1980s, some of you aren't old enough to know this, but back in the 1980s, it wasn't China that was regarded as the economic competitor, prime economic competitor to the U.S. and the West. It was Japan, because Japan had an economic trajectory like this. It was really quite remarkable, and people believed that, you know, projecting forward into the future, that Japan would be the world's predominant economic power. And one of the things that happened was that Japan wasn't willing to let things burn. And so they propped up all sorts of institutions too big to fail. Right. And then they just lived along like three-quarter dead corpses, and, you know, and
the last decade.
Yeah, dragged everything down with them. And, you know, sometimes it's more merciful to let something die than to let it linger on in the three-quarters dead state forever, you know, killing everything around it.
Right.
Partly because you
No wonder we talk about zombie banks, zombie economies. Yeah.
It's a good metaphor. So the advantage to not being centralized is that no one has to make those death decisions, right? They just happen. And that sucks if you happen to be one of the people who's dying. But the problem is, and you might think, well, wouldn't it be great if no enterprise failed? And the answer to that is, well, no, actually it wouldn't be great, because you don't get success without failure, right? Success is a relative thing.
So we're getting close to wrapping up. I wanted to ask you, you're very involved in education. I think you're involved in a reform of education together with other individuals that do long-form content on the internet, traveling teachers, maybe even you could argue like the new sophists who laid the basis for classical Greek philosophy. This idea that if you're fluid, you can question things better than if you're embedded in institutions. And so I know you have some things in the works. You recently resigned from your position at the university. I guess it's a twofold question. I want to ask, what are the things you're working on? What are you excited about? And also, what gives you hope? What gives you hope for the future?
Okay, so yes, that's 3 questions. No, that's fine. I'm just getting straight in my mind here. Well, we have 2 projects that are coming out very soon. The first one is an app called Essay, and you can find out some more information about it if you want on my website, which is jordanbpeterson.com. And when I was a university professor, I found that I had to teach my 4th year undergraduate honors students to write, because despite having been in the education system for 16 years, and despite being bright and academically able, because it was actually a competitive position to be in the psychology honors track, the students, their writing was abysmal. And you might think, well, that's not so bad because they know other things. It's like, no, not really. If you can't write, it's because you can't think. And if you can't think, then it doesn't matter what you know, because you're like, you've got all these tools, but you don't know how to use them. So, maybe you're going to what do? You hit your watch with a hammer and fix it that way? It's not very sophisticated. And so, I tried to figure out what I was doing when I was teaching people to write. And so generally what you do is to teach someone to write is you have them write something and then you criticize it, in detail. And that's actually unbelievably expensive, because, well, imagine what it requires is, well, first of all, you have to write, and that's labor intensive. But more to the point, I have to read it if I'm the grader. And if I'm a grader who could actually help you, I have to be able to write and to think myself. And if I can write and think myself, I probably have better things to do than read your damn essay. So that's a big problem, because you can see that there's an economic problem there that's really quite intractable, because you can't pay people enough to do work that difficult if they're competent, because, like I said, they could go do something else. And what I eventually ended up doing in my 4th year class was I had the students write a 4-page essay, and then the same essay again but 6 pages, and then again but 8 pages. And the first time they handed it in, I told them, prepare yourself, because I'm going to tear you into pieces. But it'll only be like 5% of your grade, so I'm going to cut you off at the knees, but there won't be any long-term consequences of that, so maybe you can tolerate the criticism. And then I tried to figure out how I went about criticizing their writing. And so, what are you looking for in good writing? Well, you have to pick the right word. And I don't know how many of you have spent any time writing, but it's certainly something you need to do. if you're an entrepreneur, because you have to communicate with your clients, let's say, with your customers and your employees, and the people who loan you money and the people who invest in you, all of that, so you better know how to write. But you want to pick the right word, and you want to organize the word into the right phrases, and you want to organize the phrases into a coherent sentence. And the sentence is sequenced into a proper paragraph, which should be the repository of approximately one reasonably well-developed idea, and then you want to sequence the paragraphs so that they make an intelligible whole. And so when you write, you should be trying to answer a question that's of some importance to you, and then you need to tackle the answer at every single one of those levels of analysis simultaneously, like at least by the time you're finished. And so I told students that that's what I did. I graded them on their word choice and their phraseology and their sentence structure, all of that. And then with regards to the impact of the essay as a whole. And I wrote a guide to writing that emerged out of that analytic philosophy. And then I worked with my son over the last 4 years to build that into a piece of software. So this is a writing, it's a word processor. Not really, it's really more like a sentence processor, but it has tools built into it that help you. For example, imagine you have a paragraph, you've written a paragraph. The right way to write something would be pick an idea, pick a question you're interested in answering, and try to answer it. It has to be one you're interested in answering, because otherwise the whole bloody thing's a lie. So you've got to start off on the right foot. It has to be something important to you. And so you have a question, now you're essaying to answer it. Essay means attempt. And so imagine that you write out your thoughts, you do your research, you write out your thoughts, you make a first draft that's 2 or 3 times as long as the finished product will be, which is what you should do to begin with, although no one does, because they don't want to throw away what they've written. But that is what you should do. And then imagine you have a paragraph in front of you. You want to break the paragraph down into sentences, and so you can see each sentence separately. Then you want to write variants of each sentence and pick the best variant. And then you want to reshuffle the sentences within the paragraph so that you get better and better variants of the paragraphs, and then you want to pick the best variant of the paragraph. Anyways, this program has tools that first of all, teaches you that you should do that. Because you need to know how to think about it.
Wow, it sounds fascinating.
And then, so that's what that program does. So hopefully it'll be out in about a month, and then just we were trying to figure out how to scale.
I'm sorry, we're just close to having to wrap up.
Okay, I'll finish in 1 minute.
Of course.
Okay, so that's available, and it'll be out and ready within a month, I hope. And hopefully it'll help people write and therefore think. And the other project is my daughter called Peterson Academy, which isn't a name I'm that thrilled with, but works well on the marketing front. We've organized about a dozen professors now. Everyone we've talked to has said yes, which really surprised me. A number of them from Cambridge, some good evolutionary biologists. They're going to do relatively brief courses, 8 hours, something like that, lecturing only about what they really love. And we're going to make those publicly accessible. And so,
So still very much an entrepreneur.
Yes. Oh yeah, I'll close with this. This is on the ethical front, once again. Here's 2 other justifications for capitalism and for free markets. The first is that it gives warlike people something to do that isn't destructive. Right? That's worth thinking about, because that desire to expand, that desire to build empire, let's say, that's not all pathological. And capitalism does allow people to generate their own kingdom, right? And hopefully one that other people want to partake in. And so that's a really big deal, that's a mechanism that enables us to productively harness the aggressive and assertive element of the human personality. That's to be able to transmute that into something positive. That's an unbelievably useful enterprise, and capitalism doesn't get any credit for that, and that's sad. And then the other thing is that I run every single project I am involved in on a for-profit basis, And the reason for that isn't so much that I want the profit, although I'm not averse to that, and maybe I can do some additional interesting things with the money. But one of the things that I have learned is that it's really good discipline. If you can't make your idea attractive enough to other people so that they're willing to give you money for it, it's possible that it's a stupid idea or that you're doing it badly. And you actually need to know that, because it's back to the zombie problem, right? You think, well, we shouldn't subsidize zombies. It's fair enough. Do you want to be one? Well, I can live along and someone will support me. Well, that's not life, and if you run your enterprises by the profit maxim, it disciplines you and stops you from ending, makes you fail when you should fail. And you think, well, I don't want to fail. It's like, it's better than limping along half dead. So, all right.
Thank you so much.